My name is Sonkin, and I am indeed a Slavicist. I've graduated from Moscow State University as a specialist in Slavic languages and literatures, and in Russia it usually means everything Slavic except Russian. There is even a special word for that, Innoslaviansky. So I studied Serbian and Polish, and I worked for 4 years at the International Tribunal for Reform in Yugoslavia as a Serbian to English translator, and after that I continued to work. My PhD thesis was on verse systems of Serbian, Croatian and Slovenian poetry, and after that I continued to work as a translator, as a teacher of translator, together with Dr. Alexander Borisenko, who is present here, and as a journalist writing in Russian language and English language publications, mostly on cultural and literary matters. I even had a brief stint as a radio host. That was a program specifically devoted to the destinies of Russian language. It was short-lived, but I managed to invite Sasha Brzezichevsky to speak at this program, and my co-host was very inquisitive about why are they so interested in Russia and Norway? What evil plans are they having? So all that puts me in position to observe the language both from within as its speaker and somebody who teaches language-related things and who writes and lectures and so on. My education also gives me, as every linguist knows, some kind of an outside perspective, so that we can see certain things more objectively and historically. When it comes to burning issues of any kind, our professional preparation, our professional abilities come in direct conflict with our emotions. And it's very evident in all matters. I will give you a couple of examples. Climate. Climate change has been a major topic of discussion for many years by now, and when it comes to that, we can see that, for example, Barry Cunliffe, a very prominent British archaeologist, writes in his recent that there has been a number of major climatic change throughout the history of the Earth and also throughout the history of the mankind within the last million years or so. But humans have now for the first time begun to have a direct and potentially devastating effect on the all-controlling climate. Basically what he says before that directly contradicts that statement. And without having to say anything about this problem, where I'm not a specialist at all, I can see that here the emotions of a human being who listens and who is worried about things that are happening to our planet take precedence over the cognitive capacities of a scientist. History. This is a quote from a book which was very well received and well known recently. It's 2006, The War of the World, History's Age of Hatred, by the British historian Niall Ferguson. And he writes in his foreword that the 100 years after 1900 were without question the bloodiest century in modern history, far more violent in relative as well as absolute terms than any previous year. Well, this without question is what poses a question in my mind, at least, because this is certainly not without a question. He acknowledges that himself in other parts of the book, and even the statistics that he gives are very far from being waterproof. So, and there are other opinions on the matter, including those that say that the 20th history was actually the least bloody in human history. Again, here is something that we humans are very likely to do. We are very selfish, we're self-centered, and we say that our times are the best, the worst, that our times are the most catastrophic or crisis prone and so on. And ever since the Egyptian and Babylonian laments about the modern youth and Cicero, it has been the staple of observation. This is a borderline example. This lady is not, well, she is a medical doctor, but she is known as a prominent lawmaker in Moscow City Council. And she has been very vocal and successful in curtailing sex education programs and any kind of commercials or advertising for sexually transmitted diseases protection means and so on, condoms and so on, and in promoting George Bush style abstinence programs. And you can imagine what kind of effect that has on reproductive health. And here again, in one of her interviews, she says, without taking a breath in between, that condoms leave women virtually unprotected. And then she goes on to say about the catastrophic situation with abortions in Russia. So this is again something where emotions certainly take precedence over reason. When it comes to language, we are all extremely schizophrenic. I mean, people who are professionally dealing with language, such as linguists and literary scholars, translators, educators, and so on. Exactly because we are in this dual position. We're on the one hand feeling the landslide of the norm, the catastrophic situation in education, the sloppy ways of the young people, and on the other hand we have to think objectively and to observe it somehow in a more measured way. In my lecture I have tried to avoid the prevalence of emotions over reason, but I couldn't do it altogether. There will be a couple of digressions which I will try to clearly indicate as such, and which will focus on my pet peeves about the modern state of the language, of the Russian language, and what's happening to it. But otherwise I will mostly talk about other people's reactions to those matters. This is a recent book which was quite well known, and I think that the project is going to, it's well known to the project, I guess, and Sonkin is a linguist who wrote a book called "Русский язык на грани нервного срыва." It's the Russian language on the verge of the nervous breakdown, which is an allusion to a Spanish movie from 1988, Mujeres al borde de ataque de nervios, by Pedro Almodovar. And basically, Dr. Krongaus is doing exactly that. He is writing this book as a citizen, as a concerned citizen who is worried about the sorry state that the Russian language has sunk into. There is just one exception, and it's reduced to a footnote, where he says that my position as a linguist, that the Russian language is not threatened, that the fast changes will be digested, that the Russian will work out new norms, stability will replace chaos, and chaos is not necessarily a bad thing. But that's it. Apart from that, everything else is just being worried about what's happening to the language and complaints about some really very bad things. So it's very clear that in such issues as current language, as the rapid changes that are happening to it, everyone is a little bit of panic monger. Here's a good example. This is Hans Weigel, an Austrian writer and critic, who wrote in 1974 that every age claims that his language is more endangered and threatened by decay than ever before, but in our time, however, language is really endangered and threatened by decay than ever before. So this is exactly the kind of mentality that we're going to talk about. So before we discuss the decay, the decline, and the catastrophe of the Russian language, We'll talk a little about things that are happening to other languages. And since we've started the German language code, let's start with German. So this is a letter to the editor of Der Spiegel in 2000, in the year 2000. And here we see that the spelling reform is irrelevant in the face of the ruin of our language caused by the spread of the unspeakable German-English linguistic group. A very common sentiment. But it's not new. Here we see that Gustav Wustmann, a German philologist and historian, at the end of the 19th century, was saying exactly the same thing. The German will remain the fool of the other nations, and there is widespread aping of the French and the English. Jakob Grimm, of the Brothers Grimm fame and well-known historical linguist, wrote in 1819 that 600 years ago, every common peasant knew or used daily the perfections and subtleties of the German language, which the best language teachers can't even dream of these days. So basically he was saying that in that 6 years before his time, German language was doing much better than it is now. And mind you, this is the time of the greatest blossoming of German poetry, of Goethe, and then a little bit after Heine and so on. So there you are. The Germans were critical not just of their own language, but of other languages as well. And here we see another well-known historian of language, the prominent figure of in the European studies, August Schleicher, who wrote that the English language has moved away far from its written form, thus providing a clear proof as to how fast the language of a historically and literally endowed people can sink. The English were also quite critical about their language. There is a well-known quote from Samuel Johnson, and by the way, wherever I would try to put a face on the quote so that you could see who were these people saying all these horrible things about their languages. Samuel Johnson wrote in the preface to his Dictionary of the English Language that tongues, like governments, have a natural tendency to degeneration. These days, this is a quote which is, there are zillions of quotes like that. This is just a random one which I took from a conservative American website. And it says that the peak of the English language was, arbitrarily granted, was the time of Chesterton, Goldsworthy, C.S. Lewis, and Tolkien. All right, so that's about the mid-20th century. It was subtle, it was robust, it was a curious mixture, and so on, but no longer. But if we come back to the times of Chesterton, Lewis, Tolkien, and Goldsworthy, for example, if we look at what George Orwell said in his well-known essay, Politics and the English Language, he said that the English language is in a bad way. Right? When was it in a good way? Was it good in the late 18th century? This is Thomas Sheridan, the father of the better-known Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the author of the Vanity Fair. And as you see, he says here that some of the people who are to blame are the people in the elite who are taking up the vulgar manners of the lower classes and using it as if it's okay. And if something is not done to stop this growing evil, English is likely to become a mere jargon. So here we see that Mr. Sheridan is already trying to pinpoint some of the reasons for the decline of language. It's the indifference of the educated elite to the seeping of bad language from, so to say, from the lower social strata. And another thing, which we'll also find in many more quotes, is something has to be done. Something has to be done to stop this evil. And you see that during the reign of Queen Anne, it's probable that English was spoken in its highest state of perfection. Let's go back to the time of Queen Anne. And this is Jonathan Swift, smack in the middle of Queen Anne's reign. And this is a proposal for correcting, improving, and ascertaining the English tongue. And here he addresses the First Minister, saying that our language is extremely imperfect. Its daily improvements are by no means in proportions to its daily corruptions. And pretenders to polish and refine have chiefly multiplied abuses and absurdities. It defends against every part of grammar, and so on and so forth. Then there is again an invective against people who are at fault, and this time they are the poets, because they shorten words, they mangle the language the way they like, and so on. And again, we'll see this in many other forms. This will not necessarily be poets, that will be foreigners, teenagers, lower classes, and so on and so forth, but you have to find an enemy. French. Is French any better? Not really. So Marc Fumerali is the member of the French Academy, and he says that the French language is degraded by pretentious pedagogism, replete with jargon and ignorance, which is poisons for the young minds. A famous discussion occurred at the session of the French Academy in 1843. It was reported by one of the participants in his memoirs. And author and critic Victor Cousin that he knew when exactly the French language started to decline. The decline of the French language has begun in 1789, so with the French Revolution and France. And another member of the Academy, Victor Hugo, famously said, could you tell us at what time exactly? Briefly, shortly before Hugo was reporting that incident in his memoirs, the linguist Gaston Paris wrote that the fate of the new Romance languages actually is quite obvious, because what was happening to them is that they were just using the bits and scraps of the good old languages of Latin. And basically what he says here is that French is nothing more than a degenerate Latin, that it couldn't become as great as Latin used to be because it was already using some depleted material. Can you guess what comes next? Cicero, writing in 46 BC in his dialogue Brutus, or of the Orators, and here, very characteristically of Cicero, we can see that almost every complaint about language is squeezed into a very brief passage. So he says that about 100 years ago, language was much better than it is now. That it was not corrupted by domestic barbarism, that people spoke it clearly and in general well. So things have changed for the worse, and both in Rome, as it had been the case in Athens, people came in and they corrupted the language. So the influx of immigrants, the influx of non-educated people, the influx of speakers of other languages corrupts our language. And again, we see an appeal to the authorities to do something, to put some norms in place to stop the decline of the language. Interestingly though, this is written at a moment which is considered by later classicists, by later specialists, as the very peak of Latin prose, and actually the prestige of Cicero himself is so high that in many textbooks and some dictionaries, whenever a quote is not attributed, it's by default by Cicero. And of course, the same thing is happening to Norwegian, and the recent book by Guru Flogstad and others more explores some of the language myths of that kind in different languages, but also, of course, in Norwegian. So, who or what is to blame for the sorry state of all languages in the world? Lots of reasons to complain about, but they can be broadly divided into three categories. And they are, in no particular order, a general chaos. Mostly this chaos is social, and this is kind of internal upheaval that uproots everything that's good and stable in the society, including its language. It's foreign influence. This is also a social reason, but it doesn't come from within, it comes from without. Quite often, again, the two are combined. And third, importantly for your current project, is technology. And the advances of new technologies have always been critical and usually quite harmful in the eyes of the beholder to the language. So, now let's see how these three factors have been discussed in the never-ending story of the Russian language's decay, with an occasional glimpse of other languages, because there will be clear parallels. But before that, yeah, so here, point one, chaos. Before that, I'd like to digress a little and to say just a couple of words about one of my favorite points about the current decline of the language or its change. More mind. So this is Kornichikovsky. We'll meet him many more times in the course of this lecture, because he wrote a very interesting book, Alive as Life, Живой как жизнь, in 1962. It's the book about the Russian language, and it's actually a very good kind of a non-scholarly book with observations, with some insights. Tchaikovsky was a famous children's writer, a translator, an educator, and he was active for a very long period of Russian literature, ever since the late 19th century to the 1960s. So here, for example, he's complaining about the non-standard use of the word пальто, coat, which becomes, which in standard Russian it's indeclinable, пальто, пальто is пальто, and so on, but which is declinable in substandard Russian of non-educated people, so to say. So, я по-прежнему тяжко страдаю, если в моем присутствии кто-нибудь скажет, что нигде не находит пальта, или идет себе домой за пальтом, and so on. And then he says that he tries to console himself with the French history of this word, and so on. So basically, he says that there is a standard non-declinable form of the word. It's a word of the neuter gender, and it becomes declinable in non-standard Russian, and probably this is a tendency that will continue to grow. He was wrong, because actually the current tendency, at least, is not to decline the words of neuter gender which end in O, at least toponyms, the names of geographical objects. For example, I live in a district of Moscow which is called Medvedkovo, and it used to be я поеду в Медведково, я приехал из Медведкова, я живу в Медведкове, but not anymore. It's not declinable anymore. Я живу в Медведково, я приехал из Медведково, я живу в Медведково, and so on. So the grammar still says it should be declinable, but it's not. At least in 99% of the cases. So here are a couple of examples. This is a well-known poem by Alexander Mezherov, a very harsh poem about the artillery during the Second World War, shooting friendly fire. Basically, it's a poem about friendly fire. Мы под Колпином скопом стоим, артиллерия бьет по своим. Это наша разведка, наверное, ориентир указала неверно. And this is Alexander Gorodnitsky, a geophysicist and an author of many songs and poems, who says, several decades later, что потеряли и потеряли вообще что-нибудь, став песнями такие стихи, как мы под Колпином скопом стоим. So you see, even when it's a quote, in 2001, a poet doesn't remember that it should be declined. This is Arseny Tarkovsky, an excellent poet who is perhaps better known to many people in Russia as well as in the West as the father of Andrei Tarkovsky. This is Andrei Tarkovsky in his lab, the well-known director. But he's an excellent poet and probably, I think that he's a major figure than Andrei Tarkovsky. So this is a poem from 1966. Казалось, что этого дома хозяева навечно в своей довоенной Европе, что не было, нет и не будет Сараева, и где не эти мазурские топи. So this is an anonymous quote from 2003, and you see that in two cases, пока добирался из Сараево, вспоминал только это здесь, в Сараево, so what should have been из Сараева, в Сараеве. This is a poem by Роберт Рождественский. Не зря в судьбе аллеек знамя, не зря на нас надеется страна, священные слова Москва за нами, мы помним со времен Бородина. And then you see a quote from Mikhail Zadornov, who is a humor writer and also a freak etymologist. So this is a very popular obsession with some people in Russia, well, not just in Russia, but in Russia it's an epidemic. People who invent etymologies and reduce every language in the world to Russian. But this is not about that, this is just a quote about Borodino, where you see that it doesn't decline anymore. Okay. So, back to chaos. So, current laments about chaos mostly focus on periods of landslide. And the favorites are naturally the post-revolutionary changes and the post-Soviet changes, which are often defined in these terms as a catastrophe. Here we see one of the modern reactions is just a journalist and a politician, a member of some public chamber of young people, a nice smiley face, who says that the decline of the Russian language is one of the systemic manifestations of the decline of the Russian nation, and stupid norms only legalize a velvet reform which is democratic, that is destructive. Another very current quote, it's an essay submitted to the competition called Language in the Net, and these essays were written by students or high schoolers, so many of them are very naive. But I was looking through them exactly because these naive attitudes show very clearly what is the mood of the society regarding language change. So, and here it says, we used to communicate so beautifully around 1960. How do you do? How are you getting along? We like going to the cinema, blah, blah, blah. And what now? So what he says in Russian. Сейчас что? Hi, как life твой? Не хочешь гонять в кино? People говорят, хавают туржаку. Frankly, I've never heard anything like that. I don't think people speak like that. But, okay, here again, someone who is not quite familiar with that kind of jargon takes separate parts from it, jumbles it, and says, well, see how awful it is. And also there are very interesting, I would say, Russophobic quotes about Russians doing everything bad to their languages as opposed to the English or the Germans or the French, because they would never change something that's beautiful as it is. Okay, but we've seen what the Germans and the French have to say about it. Another example of chaos is the mixture of different strata, of different layers of stylistic deafness, so to say. It's when the language of the gutters, the language of the criminal communities, seeps into the language of the radio, of television, and of politicians. And of course our former president and current premier Vladimir Putin is a prime example, because he is actually a trendsetter in this sense. This is an early and very well-known quote from 1999, before he was even elected president, after a series of terrorist attacks in Moscow and other cities, and some kind of attack in Chechnya on alleged terrorists at an airport. He said that we'll pursue terrorists everywhere. They're in the airport, they're at the airport. And that means, if you'll excuse me, if you catch them in the loo, we'll whack them in the outhouse after all. And this is clumsy, but it's clumsy in Russian as well. There is a hint of unease in this quote, because he wasn't quite confident in his use of that kind of speech in official context than as he is now. But there are other examples. Here is a quote on border dispute with Latvia. Непуталовский район не получит от мертвого осла уши. Literally, what they'll get is a dead donkey's ears. Or, we'll be chewing snot for years. And there are actually, on the internet you can find whole lists and page, several screens long, of quotes like that. Okay, so the complaints, and of course this, on the one hand, it is imitated on many levels. On the other hand, it's also resented, and many people say that, perhaps without calling names, but they say that when politicians speak like criminals, it's not good, and it's bad for our language, and so on and so forth. This is nothing new, again. Here is a quote from Piotr Vязemsky, another man whose literary career was exceptionally long, who was a friend of Pushkin, but who lived well into the later years of the 19th century. And here he's ranting against words бездарность and талантливый, which are completely normal words now. Бездарность is even a little old-fashioned by now. So he says that the word sympathetically that the writer Dmitriev was right to say that our new writers learn the language from shopkeepers. An appeal to authorities. Another general trend. This is a quote from Pushkin in his later years in an article which is called The Russian Academy. So it's basically devoted to what the Russian Academy focused on conserving and fostering culture and literature should look like. And so he says, our wonderful language under the wheels of unlearned and unskilled writers is quickly verging towards its decline. Words are mangled, grammar wavers, orthography, this heraldry of language is changed at anyone's whim. Our magazines have even less correct spelling than common sense. Again, mind you, this is written at a time when Pushkin has recently written Boris Godunov and Bедный всадник and some of the best works ever written in the human language. So you can see that there is no direct connection between the complaints and the actual states of language and literature. One of the few optimistic quotes I found about Russian was from Stalin. That's his well-known article, Marxism и вопросы языкознания, Marxism and Problems of Linguistics, where he, well, it's a separate story. But anyway, what he says, among other things, is that Russian hasn't changed radically since the time of Pushkin, which is quite correct. And he even says that the grammar structure of the language has improved. But that's probably because he wants to say that what happened during the years of the Soviet rule was good for everything, including language. Here, a Soviet writer, Boris Lavrenyov, says that he suffers physically when he hears mangled words like учеба instead of учение, глажка instead of глажение, зачитать instead of прочесть or прочитать. And people who speak like that are the murderers of the great, mighty, truthful, and free Russian language. That's an allusion to a quote from Turgenev. The language that was used with such purity and such love for its living sound by Lenin. And again, a curious appeal to the highest authority. Lenin indeed had something to say about Russian language in his one of his later articles on cleansing the Russian language, «Очистки русского языка», which was force-fed to Russian school children when I was at school. He said, again, rather commonsensically, that some mistakes of newspaper writers make one boil with anger. For example, they use the word «будировать» in the sense of agitate, shake up, wake up, because «будировать» looks like «будить», which is wake up. But the French «bouder» means to pout, to be angry, and taking up the French Nizhny Novgorod usage, it's a quote from Krivoyev, is taking up the worst from the worst members of the Russian gentry who had studied French but didn't learn it, and secondly, mangle the Russian language. Isn't time ripe to wage war on the mangling of Russian? If we look at Lenin's own record from before, from his younger years, we will see that he did not always stick to the roots he had proclaimed. Here is a quote from his earlier article. Спор быстро свелся к анализу принципиальных тенденций ортодоксии и ревизионизма в организационном вопросе. Okay. Yeah, another digression. So this is related to the Lenin quote I just showed you about the Russian gentry who had studied French but didn't learn it. And this is something that happens very often in today's Russia, when people try to use some words or language devices or stylistic devices, but they don't know how. And so the result is usually rather pathetic. So one of my favorite pet peeves is the use of all the orthography, the pre-revolutionary orthography, with all the extra letters. It's extremely popular in Russian advertising, in billboards, in the names of shops, restaurants, used car dealerships, and so on. Anything. This is, well, you can't see it very well, I'm afraid, but this is a menu from the Cafe Pushkin, upscale, expensive restaurant in downtown Moscow, where you see that the impossible style of this. There was one of my favorite was баранина, доставленная господином ресторатором из вояжу по Грузии. And here they tried to make it look like old pre-revolutionary orthography with a font face that was impossible at those times, with lots of mistakes almost in every line, and with some very funny turns of the phrase. Even the lifts or elevators in that restaurant have this kind of spelling. This is a little bit better than the menu, by the way. I once worked as an interpreter at the shooting of a Russian TV series, and it was set in the early 19th century. So at one point it was a nature shot, and they were shooting a cemetery scene, and there was a tombstone, a prop tombstone, with writing in what they thought was old orthography. There were about 5 lines and 6 mistakes. And it's very typical. Here is a glaring example. So for those who maybe are not familiar, the last symbol, tвердый знак or year, was only placed after consonants, and never after vowels. So this is impossible. Okay, so foreign influence, the onslaught of foreign words, expressions, and so on. This is another reason for the decline of the language. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are so well acquainted with anything foreign. we can see that as long ago as the 17th century, this is a very interesting document. This is a guide written by a Russian bureaucrat and defector, Grigory Katashikhin, who defected to Sweden and wrote a report for the Swedish king about the situation in Russia. And so he writes that when time comes to teach the prince letters, they take teachers who are quiet and not drunkards and so on. But what's interesting for us here that as for other languages, Latin, Greek, German, and any other except Russian, they're never taught in the Russian state. And this situation more or less is actual to this day. Peter the Great wrote to one of his emissaries that he used overmuch Polish and other foreign words and terms in his dispatches, and he prohibits him to do that. He says, write Russian. Another quote from the beginning of the 19th century, the Russians did not tolerate the invasion of Gauls and 20 tongues, and surely they will, meaning the Napoleonic invasion, and surely they will not tolerate the dominance of alien idiom within the sacred precinct of their literature. William Küchelbecker, a friend of Pushkin, and this is by the way Pushkin's doodle of him, wrote that all Slavic phrases and idioms are relentlessly chased away from the rich and powerful Russian speech, enriching instead with Germanism, Gallicisms, and barbarism. Peter the Great was not the only Tsar to fret about the destiny of the Russian language. Nicholas II, the last Russian Tsar, was also very conscious about that, and the memoir by Alexander Masolov, by a senior administrator, reports how the Tsar did not tolerate the use of foreign words. The Russian language is so rich that one can replace foreign words with Russian words in every case. Not a single word, mind you, not a single word of non-Slavic origin should be left to disfigure our language. This is very hard to achieve, actually. Well, this is a long quote from a Russian Orthodox priest, and this comes from more or less from the extreme right, where people are saying that everything foreign is bad, that everything is Masonic, everything is Jewish, everything is evil, and we should stick to our pristine Russian Orthodox roots. Here is just one thing I would like to draw your attention to. Now, русскому человеку предписывают отныне испытывать не кураж, задор или азарт, а драйв. So again, you see one French word, another French word coming from Arabic, and one Slavic word, and they are better than an English word because they are domesticized, because they have been longer in the Russian language than this new word. And I don't think that that Father Polavinkin realizes that courage is not a Russian word. Another quote from a well-known Russian writer, Valentin Rasputin, and here what struck me most is that the spelling of the word parachute is in our blood, in our genes. This is a little far-fetched, I think. And actually, what it relates to is to some zany rumors that they were going to replace the current spelling of the word parachute with a U to the spelling with an U, which is much more basically natural for the language, for the ear. But here, the traditionalist in Rasputin rebels about it. This gentleman has been waging war on the decline of Russian for many years. This is the professor of Moscow Linguistic University, Andrei Chuzhakin, is a translator and interpreter. And basically this is the same set of complaints: Americanization, degradation, dehumanization, endarkment, and so on. And there is a phrase which I didn't quite understand. This one: Вам наш nation message, русскому comeback. I don't really understand what he wants to say. I understand that he wants to say that Russian has to come back, to return, to take over English, but what are these words? I don't know, especially nation. Is it national? Is it nation? I don't know. On the other hand, again, you remember Lenin. Mr. Chuzhakin is kind of makes the same mistake. Презентовал на пресс-конференции концепцию лингвистическо-культурной безопасности. Again, out of 7 words, just one Slavic one. And exactly in the context where there shouldn't be such a barrage of foreign words. A recent quote from MORGENBLADET, from the Norwegian newspaper, about English becoming the modern Latin and Norwegian losing as a language. As we see, this sentiment is not unique to Russia. So, the reason number 3 is technology. Why such pictures? Why not computers, mobile phones, and so on? The point I wanted to make here is that technological change is not something that has only started to occur recently. It has been with us ever since the invention of cooked food, of wheel, of smelting bronze or iron, and so on. And of course, in the field of culture, writing was a major technological breakthrough. And the difference between a scroll and the codex was also a huge technological breakthrough. Because, for example, with a scroll, you can't do anything else when you read a scroll. You have to use those hands. You can't eat or even really talk to some other people when you're listening for a book. You have to keep a whole passage of text within your short-term memory. You can't quickly go back to a passage as with the codex. So basically the difference between a scroll and the codex are very, very similar to the difference between analog and digital. I can easily imagine how with the advent of the codex, old people were saying, oh no, it's not the same, people are losing their memory, they're not reading no books anymore, they will lose the ability to read. And actually, in Plato's dialogue Phaedrus, the appearance of writing is described in almost exactly these words, that writing is bad for memory, that it gives people the pretense of knowledge instead of real wisdom. Konichikov, who we mentioned before, said that old people have always imagined, they still do, that their children and grandchildren, especially grandchildren, mangle the correct Russian speech. And this is indeed so. This is a quote which was given by Sereshev in his well-known book Язык революционной эпохи, the language of the revolutionary era. And this is a quote from the newspaper of 1923. This is just a contemporary ad from Известия. That the Russian language has severely suffered in the revolution, that shortening of words is hectic, that our words turn into separate interjection, and the reason the people give for such shortening is technology. They say it's because of the cable, because of the telegraph. We have to use short words, it's cheaper. But the writer of this article says that it's not, that the Ministry of Mail and Telegraph wants to dissociate itself from the disorders of Russian. But how? Interestingly, they say that we will keep the most common abbreviations, but everything else we will expand, and you will have to pay for that. Another interesting feature of this article is that in the text devoted to struggle against abbreviations, the author uses the word Narkom Почтей, which is Народный комиссариат почты и телеграфа. So again, the abbreviation is used in a text which is aimed, which is against abbreviations. So here, an interesting example. This is a text which is written completely with Latin letters and numbers, but which is essentially in Russian. This is a kind of a transliteration, which is quite often used by Russian computer and SMS text message users. У SMS есть маленькая особенность, они платные. То есть подростки, как самые активные пользователи SMS, сокращают текст SMS почти до потери смысла, лишь бы SMS не разбивалось на 2. Если честно, то я не совсем в теме про то, как изгаляются подростки, чтобы ужать текст, потому как общаться по СМС не люблю. Главная ловка русскоязычных отправителей в том, что они пишут транслитом, потому что латинскими символами 160, а кириллицей только 70. Well, the reason for that, which is given in this text, is that technologically you can use the letters of the basic Latin alphabet to write a message which is 160 symbols long. But as soon as you use even a single Cyrillic or Norwegian special symbol, you switch into another coding, and then you can only use 70 symbols in one SMS. Sometimes you can't see it, but you have to pay for 2 or 3 or so on and so forth. So this is one of the reasons where some people would say that this is the direct Western plot to harm Russians. Here, John Humphreys, a British journalist who writes a lot about the sorry state of the English language, says that the relentless onward march of the texters, the SMS vandals, who are doing to our language what Genghis Khan did to his neighbors 800 years ago. They're destroying it, they're savaging our sentences, raping vocabulary, and they must be stopped. But how will you know? So this is another quote from the same article. So instead of aiding communication, it can be a barrier. I can work out BTW, by the way, but I was baffled by Impo, you are great. Okay? It means, in my humble opinion, you are great. But once again, how would you know? It's like, I don't know, coming to Norway and saying they call cheese ost. How do you know? Why don't they call it like normal people do? Mr. Humphreys doesn't realize that this is a different idiom which one has to learn. Technological change is not necessarily happening within or to the language. Sometimes it can be external. And here is another quote from Tchaikovsky's book. This is a cartoon of Tchaikovsky, and the fly is because one of his better-known children's poems about a fly, Mucha. And this is the Sputnik. And he writes basically that the word Sputnik, which means companion in Russian, fellow traveler, has lost its primary meaning forever. And from now on, it can only mean the satellite. And today, the writers who wrote about Sputniki in the sense of companions would not have written that. Well, anyone reading these lines 40 plus years hence today knows that this prediction hasn't come true. The word Sputnik is completely normal in the Russian language in the sense of in the old sense of companion, and the new sense of the satellite, which is still used in Russian, just developed into a different compartment, and it doesn't bother the original sense. But if you look at the corpus of the Russian language for the time when Tchaikovsky writes, you can see that he was wrong even for his time. That even in the 1960s, the word Sputnik continued to be used in its original sense without much interference from the new sense. So sometimes our intuitions deceive us. This is a screen from the Russian social network Vkontakte, which is a kind of a Russian Facebook for teenagers. It's a ripoff of Facebook, actually, and it's the I think it's the largest. It's the Russian site with the largest number of users. And here, indeed, even people who are well aware of what's happening to the Russian language, they have to put some effort into understanding what's going on. So, what's happening here? Здорово, человек. Чего делаешь? Вообще ты как? So, hi, what are you doing? How are you? Здорово, милашка, I guess. Все крутяк. Сегодня рубился в игруху, зашибенно просто, чего сама. Hi, cutie, everything's cool. I played a video game today. It's great. How are you doing? Я нормально, кстати, спасибо за песню, просто кайфец. Сейчас пойду хавать, есть. Бабушка сделала суп. Хочешь, приходи. I'm okay, thanks for the song. It's Cool. I'm going to eat now. Grandma has made a soup. Do you want some? Come over. Бде суп бяка. Не люблю суп. Ха-ха-ха, забыл тебе сказать, я ж ботан теперь. 5 по контре, прикинь, юпи. So I think this there means something like yak, soup. I don't like it. By the way, I forgot to tell you, I'm a nerd now. I've got an A, or the highest mark, for a test, UP. So UP is just UP. Depressing. Again, this is not limited to Russian, and an Australian poet and copywriter, Rebecca LaFar-Smith, says that we're no longer taught the purposes of a comma, and many children never learn about the semicolon, the horror. With fast food, online shopping, the television, and test tube babies will swiftly erode the human condition, and language is obviously one of the first cultures to suffer. Another similar sentiment: the internet exerts a harmful influence on people, their psyche, on society, and on language in general. By the way, interestingly, this is very typical for such complaints about Russian, you start with something proof, but you don't. You just say the internet is bad. And one cannot help mentioning that most loan words have a Russian counterpart. This is very interesting. Nickname, pseudonym. Okay, pseudonym is a Greek word. Ban, блокировка. Again, блокировка, block, it's not a Russian. Online, реальное время. This is just wrong, but again, реальное is not Russian. And this is something that's that we've seen already a couple of examples, and I remember that once at one conference, a teacher and a translator stood up and said that the word lobster when we have a good Russian word amar. Well, amar, of course, is also from French, but it's been Russianized for a longer time than lobster, and it's now perceived as a Russian word in Lord Teddy's words leads directly to crime, murder, and everything else. I would like to conclude on telling a few words about the scholar whose attitude to the destinies of the Russian language and culture was perhaps the most sobering and balanced in the last several decades. This is Mikhail Leonovich Gasparov, who was and students of Russian, I think, just must know his works because, first of all, he wrote in a Russian language that is so clear, lucid, and brilliant that I don't know any other examples in academic writing or anywhere else. He was a specialist in classical antiquity, the most prominent specialist in verse theory, including history of European verse, not just Russian. He was a major proponent of exact methods in literature. And he always, in Russian, as you probably know, there is no distinction between art, between science and humanities, between scholar and scientist. But when Gasparov was saying that he was ученый, of course he meant first and foremost scientist, because for him this gap between the sciences and humanities had to be bridged. He was also a translator and a scholar of translation theorist. He was a memorist whose book Notes and Quotes from the year 2000 was a major event on the Russian literary scene, and an educator who wrote about basically every field of his immense scholarly expertise, so that it was accessible to people without any formal training. I wanted to say a few words about him because his attitude to language change and to the study of language in action was, in my opinion, which in this case is not so humble, was the most productive. Two examples. One brief example is Roman Jakobson famously said in one of his articles from 1935, basically that Mayakovsky is a poet of metaphor and Pasternak is a poet of metonymy. Gasparov went on to study this thought, and he found out basically that first of all, metaphor is prevalent both in Pasternak and Mayakovsky, and second of all, there are instances when Pasternak has more metonymies than when Mayakovsky has more metonymies than Pasternak. So one cannot say that Pasternak is more metonymical than Mayakovsky. He is more metonymical than one thing, but less metonymical than other. And Jakobson's claim is not borne out on linguistic or stylistic level. Is Pasternak is the poet of metonymy? It is in some other extended sense. Gasparov was very, very cautious of this. And this is another quote which is an answer to the questionnaire, a very stupid questionnaire of a glossy magazine. I think it's defunct by now. Again, with a presupposition which is contained already in the question. Why do you think in our recent totalitarian past literature was on the rise, but when all bans were lifted, it ceased to exist? And the answer is very Socratic. Was it really on such a rise? Has it really quite ceased to exist? And the lesson for us, I think, is that whenever we find people complaining about the decline of anything from culture to language to morals to standards to education and so on, we should first of all ask ourselves, was it really on such a rise before? Is it really so catastrophic these days? Because sometimes our feelings contradict our contradict the facts, and I think it's an excellent thing that the good people at Bergen University are studying the landslide of the norm, which has indeed happened more than once in the recent several hundred years in the Russian language, and other cultural events within the Russian cultural landscape, as scholars and as scientists, using exact methods and trying to avoid emotions. So I think that probably the best way to answer the radio host's question about why the Norwegians were so keen about studying Russian, what was their real plan, was that it gives an excellent outside perspective, something that being inside the landslide, we probably cannot understand or describe. Thank you very much to all the people who helped me in preparing this lecture, and thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to answer many questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. There's plenty of time for questions, comments, protests, laments, or the opposite. Yeah, please.
I would like to thank you for this very nice talk and the way you put it in a large global perspective by introducing similar discussions in other European languages. And I think that's very much, it is very relevant to understand what's going on, and you can really see parallels from the quotes that were put up. And I would just like to add to the point of the question of your co-hostess on the radio show, that we do get those questions in Norway as well. Why do you study Russian? I mean, aren't the Russians studying the language themselves? So it's a two-way thing. But anyway, what I was wondering, you got into the point slightly towards the end when talking about the relationship between bad English and crime. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering whether, while looking at this material, whether you saw any trends in reasoning about why it is so bad that language is declining. So what is it that will happen if the language declines?
Well, there are several ways to answer that, and I skipped one of the quotes, which said that the smaller European languages, and the author listed Danish, Swedish, and Dutch for some reason, that they're disappearing, that English is taking over, and that in a short time there will be no indigenous European languages. Everything will be just covered with English, because these languages will, right now, he says, they are only in families and on the streets, because education, TV, everything else, it's in English. And in 100 years' time, it will be something that will be studied by linguists who are studying linguistic relics. So I think this sentiment is also present in Russian. I can't really fathom why, because foreign languages are not a strong point of the Russian educational system. And as opposed to some other countries where indeed education is very much English language based, I don't see much of that kind in Russian. But however, at least the words which are coming into language from English mostly, in computer jargon, into the young people's slang, they create the impression that Russian is in danger of being run over by English mostly. The reason which I would like to put on the first place is the breakdown of communication, because for me, bad spelling, bad orthography, bad style is something that impedes communication. You have to put more effort and time into reading something that's sloppily written, that is brimming with mistakes, and sometimes you just don't know whether it's intentional or not, or which word was meant, and so on. So I think this is also something that some people think are a real danger when standards are falling. And then there was the quote which we also kind of skipped over from the priest, Alexander Polavinkin, who was saying that all these foreign words and billboards in Latin letters create a psychological program which is directly influencing your brain and making them ready for reprogramming by people who want to reprogram it. So there is also, this is very close to Little Green Man, but this is something that's rather, well, I wouldn't say common, but it's not unique. So I think there are some of the dangers that are perceived through the decline of the language.
So, yeah, thanks. This was really a nice survey. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess just in following up Morten's question, I'm wondering whether those same reasons, I mean, you touched on a lot of different aspects of language change. Borrowing is one, the decline of standards is another. It's manifested in all sorts of different ways, and the dangers associated with them also vary, as you so nicely illustrated. I'm wondering, where you see the emotion running the highest. I mean, because clearly some of these things are perceived with much more emotion and talked about and communicated about with much more zeal than others. And now that you've looked at this broad range of languages and quite a swath of European history, what do you see as the most sort of emotionally charged?
Well, the thing is, I tried to analyze these emotions. Mm-hmm. So that's why I tried to compartmentalize them into three distinct categories. But actually, your general complaint about the standards and language will have a mix of all three, of the falling standards, of foreign influence, and of the onslaught of new technologies. Because quite often they are not perceived as something separate. Well, if forced to somehow arrange them, I would probably put foreign influence on the first place, because this is something that's most evident, something that really hits you when you see that, for example, instead of the word which is used for cleaning personnel, уборщица, in some offices they use the word cleaning manager, or, well, there are lots of examples of that kind. All new professions which were unheard of in Soviet times: producers, managers, salespersons, system administrators, software engineers, and so on and so forth. Most of them come complete with a name taken from a different language. It happened in Peter the Great's time with naval terminology, which was wholesale borrowed from Dutch. It happened later with technical terminology, which was also more or less wholesale borrowed from German. And even sometimes now, when I translate something from or into English, I come to realize that some of the very common words in Russian technical language are German, and I didn't even think about that. So the same is happening again now with English, and because it's happening now, it creates a much more vivid reaction. So I think that the foreign influence is probably the arch enemy.
And I wonder, are there really no optimistic voices in this? I mean, it's easy to find all these laments, but since you have studied this on a broader scale, I suppose that you have also looked for more sober and optimistic views. And even when you cite a linguist like Krongasia, you cite his popular book, but he has also, I mean, written,
of course, yes,
scholarly things. But I mean, I have the same impression going to Russian conferences or chatting with Russian friends in Russia. The state of the language is lamented all the time, but I mean, you've especially looked for more optimistic voices, I presume, so I'm very eager to hear whether you found anything.
Well, the optimistic voices are a minority, but there are some, especially when some of the more outlandish laments are voiced. Sometimes when you hear something about, reprogramming of the Russian psyche with foreign words, or well, some of the other rather bizarre things that I've listed. Quite often there will be some linguist or a specialist in literature, or just a clear-minded person who would come up and say that this has been happening over and over again. And of course, even the briefest look at the history of these laments, which I tried to present here, gives you a kind of perspective of showing that that not everything is so dismal. But then again, of course, you can revert to one of the first quotes of Hans Weigel, that these days our language is really in danger.
But I mean, also, this is a way of showing that it's not all that bad. It has happened before, and language will manage to survive and all that. But even that attitude views the falling of standards or the possibilities of multiple standards perhaps as something bad. But then there is the other view, seeing a more liberal language use and perhaps different and multiple standards and so on as something tolerable and perhaps even as a good thing.
Well, there are people who use the new abilities of the Russian language very creatively, and one of our favorite examples is the translation of William Blake's Tiger, 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 Burning Bright, which has been translated many times into Russian, including the classical translation of Samuel Marshak, who always translated any poems from Shakespeare to Blake to Romantics into a kind of very purified 19th century style. So his Shakespeare is very non-violent, as opposed to the real Shakespeare. So is Blake. And somebody wrote a new translation of the Tiger using this подонковский язык. Тигр, тигр в ужаснах, киса жжет в ночных лесах. And so on. I don't remember it completely, but
Что за автор воспарив, затягачил креатив.
It was a very exact translation, very exact. It was very powerful, and I think that many people enjoyed it. Because this is something where you see how the new creative abilities of the language are actually used to create and to do something that hasn't actually been properly done before. Also, within the scope of the last 20 years, during this period of landslide, we have seen many words blossom and decline, and come into oblivion, fall into oblivion. And this is also a sobering thought, because sometimes you really rage about something. For example, I can't stand the current use of the words «походу», because it used to be a part of the saying «по ходу дела», something like «by the way», and now I think by phonetic similarity with the word «похоже», looks like, it's used like that, which doesn't make any sense to me, and it really irritates me. I don't know, perhaps there are two ways of dealing with that. First is, just clench your teeth and wait while it falls into decline, or just goes out of use, which happens to many words like that and expressions. And the other is clench your teeth and wait while you get accustomed to it and start using it, because that has also happened many times. For example, when the word pathosny in its new sense, because the word pathos, pathos, had an adjective in Russian which was patheticий, not pathetic in the English sense, but in the Beethoven sense, pathetic. But in recent years, it has acquired another adjective, pathosny, pathosny. Which means something like bombastic, posh, overblown, braggart, and so on. And I haven't used this word for a long time, but now I'm using it because it has taken up a field of sense which is not taken up by any other word. And when you want to say something that in Russian, you need it. You didn't need it before, probably because, well, I don't know why, because there were no such there were. But somehow you could get by without it, and now it's very difficult. Now you hear it everywhere, and it's almost become a normal word. Though I'm still trying to not to use the word elitny, which has all but replaced the former word elitarny. So. But again, I don't jump every time when I hear it as I used to. So, and this is something that happens all the time with the language. As you see, Vyazemsky was indignant about words like talantливый, which seem absolutely normal now, and I think they seem absolutely normal maybe 20 years after he wrote that, maybe less. So it's a matter of time.
But isn't there already now a slight difference between elitny and elitarny in meaning?
Yeah, there is.
So eventually you will use it someday when you need.
Yes, I guess, because elitarny is almost is only used in some very narrow contexts now. and it's kind of archaic.
One more question. If you look at the quotes and if you relate those quotes to what Bourdieu wrote about language and symbolic power, one can start to ask oneself whether those lamenting the decline of language is those that have something to lose by the decline of language. Thus, those who actually command a standardized, a more correct form of language, they will lament the fact that the language they have spent so much time learning and acquiring is now degrading, which means that it has all been a waste, and they'll be reduced to the level of kind of common people. Do you see any differences when it comes to laments on language between different groups, social groups of people?
Well, actually, I think I can't find that kind of link. People who lament the most are usually people whose education in the humanities is lower than those who lament less, though not necessarily so. But I would say that, again, this is a guess, this is my intuition, which is, as you have seen, may be wrong in many instances. But I think that people who are professionally dealing with languages and literatures have a more sober and more balanced attitude to the language changes they should. On the other hand, the whole institution of editors, which has been very strong in the Soviet Union, has all but collapsed. And the publishing standards are low in many publishing houses in Russia. And sometimes you see that the text hasn't even been properly proofread. So there is a group of mostly not very young people who are lamenting the present decay as opposed to the former Soviet standards. But it's very hard to distinguish a specific complaint about some linguistic fact from the general complaint about grass being greener and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Any other comments? If not, I should like to thank you once more very much for your most interesting lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.